She stood frozen, her hands gripping the folds of her skirt so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. The air was heavy with tension, and every sound, the shuffle of boots, the distant cry of a hawk seemed sharper, louder. Her voice came out trembling, almost breaking. "Please, don't lift my skirt," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make things worse. The Apache warrior before her didn't move for a long moment. His dark eyes studied her, unreadable, his expression carved in stone. He held something in his hands, not what she feared, but a thick wool blanket, its edges frayed from years of travel. He didn't reach for her clothes. He simply stood there, the blanket hanging between his strong hands, the fabric catching in the breeze like a flag. She didn't understand. The story she'd heard back in the settlement had painted them as merciless, as men who took what they wanted without pause. But here he was, motionless, looking at her with something that wasn't hunger or anger. It was something else entirely. She didn't dare step closer, yet she couldn't force herself to step back. He took a slow breath, glancing toward the rocky ridge behind them, where shadows moved among the stones, other figures watching. The tension in the air wasn't just between them. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, where danger lurks in every direction and even the smallest mistake could set it off. Her mind raced, replaying the last few hours. She'd been traveling the narrow paths alone, the path winding between red cliffs and thorny brush. She'd thought she was alone until she saw him step out from behind a boulder, the sun catching on the metal at his belt. She'd run, but he'd caught up easily. He hadn't even seemed to be running hard. When he reached her, he hadn't touched her roughly. He hadn't spoken either. Just that silent, watchful stare. And now, the blanket. She still didn't know what it meant. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hoofbeats from somewhere far off. He looked toward the sound and his jaw tightened. Then, without warning, he moved closer. She tensed, expecting him to grab her, but instead he crouched down and spread the blanket wide, holding it low, his eyes flicking to hers as if telling her without words to get down. She didn't understand why, but something in his urgency, in the way his gaze sharpened, made her obey. She crouched, and he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it forward until it covered her from neck to feet. Only then did she notice there was dust rising in the distance, the unmistakable haze of riders approaching fast. Whoever they weren't coming for a friendly visit. She glanced up at him, searching for an explanation, but he didn't give one. Instead, he stepped in front of her, placing himself between her and the oncoming riders. The others on the ridge began to move, signaling to each other, their shapes melting into the rocks. Her heart pounded. She didn't know if she'd just been saved or claimed. And with the sound of those hoofbeats getting louder, there was no time to ask. The Apache warrior glanced back at her once more, his face still unreadable, and then he turned toward the dust on the horizon. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The blanket was heavy on her shoulders, coarse but warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and sage. It was strange, that smell. It was nothing like the clean scent of linen back home, but it made her feel hidden, as though she had been pulled into another world entirely. The hoofbeats grew sharper now, cutting through the rustle of the wind. In the scrub. She couldn't see who was coming, but the Apache didn't take his eyes off the horizon. His body was still, yet there was a readiness in his stance, like a bowstring drawn tight. She wanted to ask him why he was helping her, if that's what he was even doing, but the words caught in her throat. This was a man of few expressions, and she sensed that in his world, questions were not asked lightly. Her pulse beat in her ears. She shifted beneath the blanket and looked at the ridge again. The other figures were gone, as if the rocks had swallowed them. Only he remained, standing like a wall between her and whatever was coming. her mind kept reaching backward to the events of the morning. She had left before sunrise, the settlement still sleeping. The air had been cold, her breath clouding in front of her as she walked. She'd been carrying a basket supplies for a friend's family living near the foothills. That was all. No one had known she would take the pass instead of the main trail. She had chosen it because it was shorter and because she thought no one would be there. But she had been wrong. When she first saw him, she'd nearly dropped her basket. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He hadn't shouted. He had only stepped into the path, silent and unmoving, his eyes fixed on her like he had been expecting her all along. She'd turned to go the other way, but the path behind her was already blocked. 2 more men standing in the shadows of the rocks. That was when the fear had set in, deep and cold. She had thought the worst was coming, that she wouldn't make it back to the settlement. But the moment the others on the ridge signaled, he had stepped closer and taken her by the arm, not roughly, but firmly, and led her toward this narrow bend in the pass. The wind picked up, blowing her hair into her face. The dust cloud in the distance was closer now, and through the haze she could see dark shapes riding hard. She tried to make out the colors or markings, but they shifted in the sunlight, blurring together. She didn't know if they were soldiers, raiders, or something worse. The Apache's gaze didn't waver. His hand drifted toward the hilt of his knife, though he didn't draw it. A sudden memory surfaced, an old story told around the settlement fires. It was about a time not so long ago, when settlers and Apache had clashed violently over land and cattle. In those tales, the warriors were fierce and unyielding. But her grandfather had once said something different, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "They're not all the same," he had told her. "Some will kill you without blinking. Others will save you without saying a word. The hard part is knowing which you've found." She thought of that now, staring at the man in front of her, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The riders were close enough now that she could hear the jingle of tack, the pounding rhythm of hooves in the hard earth. The Apache finally spoke, his voice quiet, but with a weight that cut through the noise. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent. He gestured toward the rocks on her left, a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a person to slip through. She hesitated, fear holding her in place, but he stepped closer, his hand pressing lightly against her arm, not pushing, but guiding. She ducked into the crevice, the stone cold against her back as she pressed herself into the shadows. From there she could see the riders better. They were not soldiers, at least, not in any uniform she recognized. Their clothes were worn, dust-stained, their hats pulled low. Rifles rested across their saddles, and their eyes swept the pass. With a sharpness that made her chest tighten, the Apache stayed in the open, not hiding, his stance calm but ready. One of the riders slowed as they drew near, his gaze locking on the warrior. Words were exchanged, short, clipped phrases she couldn't understand. The rider's voice carried a sneer. The Apache's tone was steady, almost cold. Another rider laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. She tried to make herself smaller against the rock, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to go without being seen. The tension in the air was thick, enough to choke on. The riders shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting around as if they sensed something was off. For a moment, it seemed like the standoff might break into violence. Then the lead rider spat into the dust, muttered something, and signaled with his hand. The group moved on, the sound of their horses fading slowly into the distance. But the Apache didn't relax. He waited, listening, until the hoofbeats were gone completely. Only then did he turn toward her. His eyes met hers for a long, silent moment before he gestured again, this time toward a narrow trail leading away from the pass and deeper into the hills. She didn't know where it led, but something in his expression told her she didn't have a choice. As she stepped from the crevice, the blanket still around her, she realized how much her legs were shaking. She followed him, each step carrying her farther from the place she had known and deeper into the unknown. The sun was dipping lower now, casting the land in gold and shadow. The trail wound between jagged rocks and twisted pines, the air cooler. Here, quieter. She kept glancing at his back, at the way he moved silent, sure-footed, like he belonged to the land itself. She wondered if he had saved her or simply taken her from one danger to place her in another. And with no way to ask, the question stayed locked inside her. Somewhere far behind them, the dust of the riders was settling, but she knew they weren't. The last danger she would face today. And with the blanket tight around her shoulders and the Apache's shadow leading the way, she realized she was about to find out why he had stopped her in the first place. The trail grew narrower as they moved deeper into the hills, the rocks closing in on both sides until it felt like they were walking through the ribs of the earth itself. Every sound seemed louder here, the crunch of their boots, the whisper of the blanket's fabric, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the Apache's silence pressed on her like a command. His pace was steady, not hurried, yet he never looked back for long. It was as if he trusted she would follow, but also knew she had nowhere else to go. The air cooled as they climbed higher. She could hear the faint rush of water somewhere ahead, though it was buried under layers of stone and distance. That sound was a strange comfort. Water meant life, and in these lands, life was never taken for granted. Her mind wandered back to the riders they had left behind. Their eyes, their movements, it hadn't been a casual patrol. They had been searching for something, or someone. A small part of her feared they had been searching for her, but then another thought crept in, what if they had been searching for him? That would explain the way he had stood so firmly in their path, as if blocking them was more important than avoiding them. Maybe she was caught in something far bigger than she realized. A gust of wind came through the pass, carrying the faint scent of smoke. She slowed without thinking, her eyes scanning the horizon, but the Apache didn't stop. His shoulders tightened, though, and she caught the flicker of his gaze toward the north. She followed it, but saw nothing beyond the jagged peaks and the faint shimmer of heat in the distance. Still, the unease lingered. After a time, the trail opened into a shallow basin surrounded by tall rocks. There was a small pool here, fed by a thin trickle of water that spilled down from the stones above. The Apache knelt by the water, cupping it into his hands, drinking deeply before splashing some over his face. He didn't invite her to drink, but he didn't stop her either. She knelt, the cold water burning her dry throat, and for a moment, the fear in her chest loosened. When she looked up, he was watching her again, not with suspicion, but with an intensity that made her wonder what he saw. Was she just another settler girl to him? Or did he know more about her journey than she had told? The silence between them was broken by a faint, sound-soft, deliberate footsteps above the basin. She froze, her eyes darting to the ridge. The Apache's hand was already on his knife. 3 figures appeared against the pale sky, their shapes dark in the afternoon light. They were not the same riders from before. These men wore leather and bone, their faces painted in patterns she didn't recognize. They descended slowly, not rushing, as though certain they would not be challenged. The Apache rose to his full height, his body angled slightly toward her, shielding her from view. Words passed between him and the man, sharp and quick. She couldn't understand, but she could feel the edge in them. One of the stranger's eyes flicked toward her, and his lips curled not in amusement, but in something colder. The exchange ended abruptly. The men turned and began to climb back toward the ridge, though the last one lingered a moment longer, staring down at her before finally following the others. The Apache didn't watch them go. He was already moving, signaling her to follow. She stood, pulling the blanket tighter. Her legs wanted to move faster, but he kept the same steady pace, his eyes scanning the rocks as they left the basin behind. It was clear, now he was not just leading her somewhere. He was moving her through contested ground. The land here was alive with unseen tensions, lines drawn not on maps but in blood and memory. She didn't know which side he stood on, or if there were even clear sides at all. As they wound through another narrow pass, her thoughts returned to the settlement. She wondered if anyone had noticed she was missing yet. Would they send someone after her? Would they even know which way to look? And if they did find her, would that mean crossing paths with the Apache again? And what would happen if they did? The sun was slipping lower now, the shadows stretching long and thin. They stopped once more, this time at a high overlook where the land fell away into a wide, rocky plain. Far in the distance, she could see movement, small dots that might have been riders, drifting across the open ground like ants. The Apache studied them for a long moment before turning his gaze to the west, where the horizon was streaked with a faint orange glow. It wasn't the sunset. It was fire. She followed his gaze, her stomach tightening. Whoever had lit that blaze wasn't just burning brush. Smoke like that meant something had been destroyed or was still being destroyed. She thought of the settlement, of the wooden fences and small homes. She prayed the fire was far from there. The Apache adjusted the blanket on her shoulders, his hands brief but deliberate, then motioned for them to keep moving. There was no rest, no pause to explain. Every step took them deeper into uncertainty, and every shadow seemed to hold another watchful eye. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry echoing through the rocks. The sound made her shiver. She didn't know if it was a warning or a promise. All she knew was that she could no longer tell if the man walking ahead of her was her protector, or the reason she was in danger at all. The trail dipped sharply, forcing her to plant her feet hard with each step to keep from sliding. The rocks here were loose, the kind that rolled underfoot without warning, and the sound of them tumbling down the slope echoed too loudly in the still air. She could see the Apache's shoulders tense every time one slipped. He glanced back once, not at her, but toward the ridge above them, as if he expected something to appear there at any moment. They reached the bottom of the slope and found themselves in a dry riverbed, its walls high enough to hide them from sight, but also high enough to trap him if someone came from either end. The air felt heavier here, the kind of stillness that made the skin between her shoulders prickle. She noticed the Apache was no longer looking only ahead, he was checking behind them, scanning the ridges on either side. Then she heard it, a faint clink of metal against stone. Not the wild scatter of falling rocks, but the careful, deliberate sound of someone moving slowly, quietly. The Apache stopped in his tracks, holding out a hand for her to do the same. They stood there, listening. The sound came again, closer, now followed by a whisper of movement above the dry riverbed. Her heart began to hammer. She could see nothing but the narrow strip of sky overhead, painted in the fading orange of evening, but she felt the presence of others, somewhere unseen. They were watching. She fought the urge to pull the blanket tighter. It felt like too much movement might draw every eye toward her. Without a word, the Apache moved to a large boulder set into the wall of the riverbed. He crouched low, motioning her to press against the stone. She obeyed, her palms flat to the cool surface. From here, she could see the narrowing bend ahead. If someone blocked that end, they'd be trapped between two closing jaws. A shadow flickered across the top edge of the riverbed. Then another. The figures were moving fast now, their silhouettes sharp against the dimming sky. She couldn't tell if they were the riders from before, the painted men from the basin, or someone else entirely. All she knew was that they were closing in. The Apache straightened, his knife now in his hand. The blade caught what little light was left, a glint that seemed both a warning and a promise. His eyes were fixed on the bend in the riverbed, but his body had shifted ever so slightly toward her, as if preparing for a moment where everything would break loose. A sudden sound cracked through the air, hooves pounding hard against the packed earth above them. Dust rained down from the rim of the riverbed. A voice shouted, sharp and commanding, though the words were in a tongue she couldn't understand. Another voice answered from somewhere beyond the bend, this one closer, angrier. The Apache's jaw tightened. He stepped toward the center of the riverbed, placing himself between her and both ends of the trap. The air was thick now, every second stretching long and thin. She could feel the moment approaching when one side or both would strike. Then came the whistle, high, piercing, and close. It was followed by a rush of movement above, figures running along the rim, shadows darting in and out of view. The Apache lifted his head slightly, listening. Whatever he heard in that sound, it made him shift his stance. He moved closer to her, low and quick, speaking in a voice so quiet she barely caught the words. She still didn't understand them, but the tone was enough. Stay close. The pounding of hooves was louder now, no longer just above but ahead as well. She could hear the jangle of bridles, the slap of leather against horsehide, and voices calling over each other. The riverbed amplified every sound until it felt like the noise was closing in from all sides. Her throat was dry, her hands clammy beneath the heavy wool of the blanket. A small rock tumbled from the rim and landed at her feet. She looked up in time to see a shape leaning over the edge, eyes catching hers before vanishing again. The moment was so brief she could almost believe she imagined it, but the cold knot in her stomach said otherwise. The Apache turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. He raised one hand, just for a second, as though telling her to be ready for something she couldn't yet see. The light was fading fast now, the walls of the riverbed steeping in shadow. The noise above swelled, the riders shouting more urgently. Their words clipped with tension. She didn't know who was hunting who anymore. She only knew the walls were closing in, the path ahead shrinking, and whatever was about to happen would leave no time for thinking, only for moving. The shout came. First a sharp, guttural cry from above, and then the world seemed to break apart all at once. Figures dropped into the riverbed from both sides, their boots kicking up a cloud of dust that stung her eyes. Horses skidded to a stop at the far bend, their riders blocking the way forward, while more shadows closed in behind. For one breathless heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound was the restless snort of the horses and the soft hiss of the wind slipping through the high stone walls. The Apache stepped forward, placing himself squarely between her and the approaching men. He held his knife low, not in a wild display, but with the steady grip of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Words flew back and forth between him and the lead rider, quick, sharp exchanges that she couldn't understand but could feel in her bones. The men's eyes kept flicking toward her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. One of the riders dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with a dull thud. He was older, his face weathered like sun-cracked leather, and there was something in his gaze that made her stomach twist. He stepped closer, ignoring the Apache's presence at first, until the warrior shifted just enough to block his path completely. That movement stopped the older man in his tracks. The tension felt like it could shatter at any moment. She could feel her own heartbeat in her fingertips. Then, without warning, the Apache spoke again, louder this time, his voice firm and cutting. Through the dust and noise, whatever he said made several of the men glance at each other uneasily. The older man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push forward. Instead, he spat into the dirt, muttered something under his breath, and turned away. It wasn't over yet. Two of the younger men on horseback began arguing, their voices rising until the words were nearly shouts. The Apache didn't look at Them. His eyes stayed on the older man, watching him mount his horse again. Finally, with a sharp whistle, the older man signaled the group. One by one, the riders pulled back, the sound of hooves fading into the distance until only the silence of the riverbed remained. She didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until it came out in a trembling rush. The Apache didn't lower his knife right away, waiting until the last echoes of their departure were gone. Only then did he turn to her. There was no smile, no visible relief, just a small nod, as if to say the danger had passed for now. They didn't linger. He led her out of the riverbed along a narrow side path she hadn't noticed before. The climb was steep, her legs aching with each step, but she didn't dare fall behind. When they reached the top, the world opened before them, a stretch of land bathed in the soft gold of the setting sun, dotted with low brush and distant hills. In that quiet, the tension that had held her chest tight began to loosen. As they walked, the question she'd been carrying since morning pressed harder. She had to know why he had stopped her on the trail, why he had covered her with the blanket instead of doing what she feared. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Why?" she asked. He glanced at her, not breaking his stride. But she pressed again. "Why did you help me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, in halting words, his voice low but clear, he said, "They wanted you. Not safe." He gestured toward the horizon where the riders had gone. "Blanket. Hide you." It struck her then that everything she had feared about him at the start had been wrong. The blanket had not been a threat, it had been a shield. He had seen danger long before she did, and without words, he had chosen to protect her. They walked until the last light began to fade and the first stars appeared overhead. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of a small fire flickering against the darkness. He led her toward it, and when they arrived, she found it was a campa. Modest one, with a single lean-to made from branches and another blanket spread on the ground. No one else was there. He offered her water and a place to sit, then settled near the fire himself. The night sounds filled the silence between them, the chirp of crickets, the soft crackle of burning wood. She realized this might be the only time she would have to speak freely, so she told him her name, where she had come from, and how she had been on her way to visit a family friend. She didn't expect him to respond, but he nodded, listening without interruption. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cold began to seep into the air, he handed her the blanket again. This time, she took it without hesitation. She lay beneath it, looking up at the stars, thinking of how quickly her life had shifted in the span of a single day. She still didn't know who the riders were or why they had been after her, but she knew one thing: without him, she wouldn't be. Lying here now, alive at dawn, the sky painted in pale blue and gold, he led her toward a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. From there, she could see the outline of a trail that led back toward the settlement. He stopped, pointing to it, and then looked at her with the same steady gaze he'd worn since they met. "You go," he said simply. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to ask him to come with her, to see her safely all the way back, but she knew this was where their paths would split. She nodded, and for a moment, they stood there in the cool morning air, neither moving. Then she turned toward the trail, walking until the ridge hid him from view. When she finally reached the outskirts of the settlement hours later, the familiar shapes of the small wooden houses came into sight. People hurried toward her, their faces a mix of relief and shock. They asked questions, where she had been, who she had seen, but she found herself holding back certain parts of the story. She spoke of danger, of riders on the trail, but she did not tell them everything about the Apache or the blanket. Some truths, she thought, were better kept close. In the days that followed, she often found herself scanning the distant ridges, half expecting to see his silhouette against the sky. She never did. But whenever the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and sage, she remembered the moment he had stepped between her and danger, the way he had chosen to stand his ground. What stayed with her most was not the fear, but the quiet understanding that had passed between them, two people from worlds apart, bound for a short time by the same need to survive. And in that memory she found a strange kind of peace, knowing that sometimes protection comes from where you least expect it, and words are not needed to know when someone means you no harm.